Explanations of conformity. There are three ways in which people conform to the opinion of the majority. Internalization is when an individual accepts the group's norms. This results in a private as well as a public change of behavior. This change is also likely to be permanent as attitudes have been internalized. Identification involves a person conforming to the opinions of the group as they want to feel part of the group. Opinions are only changed publicly while they still maintain their own private opinions. Finally, compliance involves simply going along with the group in public. It is a superficial change, and privately the individual will maintain his or her own opinion. The reasons why we conform can be explained by the two-process theory. Normative social influence, NSI, is a form of social influence whereby an individual conforms to the majority in order to gain approval, whereas informational social influence is when an individual will conform due to wanting to be right. Evidence to support ISI comes from a study by Lucas et al. Students were asked to give answers to mathematical problems that were easy or more difficult. His results found that there was a greater conformity to incorrect answers when the mathematical problems are harder than when they were easier. This was most true for students who rated their mathematical ability as poor. This study highlights how people will conform in situations where they feel they don't know the answer. This strengthens the support and increases the validity of ISI as an explanation of conformity, as we look to others and assume that they know better than us and they must be correct. A methodological criticism with this research is that it is subject to being sample bias as only students were questioned. Therefore, the results cannot provide an accurate generalization for the rest of society, as the participants were more likely to have better mathematical ability compared to someone who was not educated. This reduces the validity of the findings and the support for informational social influence. Research to support normative social influence explanation comes from Ash's line experiment. He found that the majority of his participants went along with a clear wrong answer because the rest of the group had done so. When questioned after the task, participants revealed that they felt self-conscious giving the correct answer as they were afraid of disapproval. These findings suggest that people will conform to seek approval from others, which strengthens the support for normative social influence explanation. A limitation of informational social influence and normative social influence is that the two-process approach is too simplistic. Conformity was reduced when there was a dissenting partner in the Ash experiment. This dissenter may reduce the power of normative social influence by providing social support, or reduce the power of informational social influence because they are an alternative source of information. Therefore, it isn't always possible to know whether normative social influence or informational social influence is at work. This questions the view of informational social influence and normative social influence operating independently in conforming behavior. This reduces the validity of normative social influence and informational social influence as accurate explanations of conformity. Ash's research into conformity. Ash carried out a lab experiment on 123 male undergraduates. In groups, male participants judged line lengths by saying out loud which comparison line 1, 2, or 3 matched the standard line. Each group only contained one real participant. The other 7 people were Confederates who acted like participants but were really helping the researcher. The real participant always gave their answer at the end, once they had heard everyone else's. The Confederates were all instructed to give the same wrong answers on some of the trials. The findings revealed that 75% of the participants conformed at least once giving the wrong answer, When they were asked why, they said that they didn't want to look different. The control condition showed that it was easy to get the right answer, which means that people conform due to normative social influence, which is when people conform to seek approval. Ash repeated his original study but added variations to the procedure to see its impacts on conformity rates. When adjusting group size, he found that with 3 confederates there was little difference in the percentage of wrong answers given by participants. When introducing the role of an ally to the experiment, i.e. another non-conforming person, Ash found that conformity levels dropped to 25%. Finally, when the task difficulty increased, Ash found that conformity levels increased, highlighting the role of informational social influence, which is wanting to be right. A methodological problem with the study is that it was conducted in an artificial environment and involved a trivial task. Participants were aware that they were taking part in a research study and may have changed their behaviour to meet the expectations of the researcher, which are demand characteristics. The task itself was not challenging enough to explain why conformity rates were so high. Therefore, the findings of the research lack ecological validity, as we are unable to make accurate generalizations as well as generalizing it to an everyday situation. A further criticism of Ash's study is that it has been considered to be a child of its time. This is because when repeated by Perrin and Spencer with engineering students in the UK, only 1 student conformed in a total of 396 trials. Ash's findings can be explained as America was extremely conformist during the time that the experiment was carried out. This is a limitation of the research, as it means that the Ash effect is not consistent across situations or times. A final weakness of the research is that the sample was restricted to males only. This makes it androcentric. Other research indicates that women are more conformist to males, as they are more concerned about social relationships. This limits Ash's study, as the findings are not applicable to both sexes and thus reduces the population validity of the research. A further limitation is that the ethical issues associated with Ash's research. The naive participants were deceived. They thought that the others in the procedure, the Confederates, were genuine, but this ethical cost would be weighed out by the benefits of the study. The main benefit was highlighting people's susceptibility to the group conformity and the variables affecting it. Thus deception in this case can be justified as the ends justify the means in Ash's research. Zimbardo's research into conformity of social roles. Zimbardo conducted the Stanford prison experiment in hopes to see whether aggression was down to dispositional or situational factors. He set up a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University, and 24 male students were recruited using an advertisement. The students were randomly allocated the role of prisoner or guard. Guards and prisoners were assigned uniforms, and prisoners were referred to by a number. Prisoners were told to follow a set of rules, and the guards' role was to enforce these rules. The guards became increasingly tyrannical and abusive towards the prisoners. The study was stopped after 6 days due to the psychological well-being of the prisoners. The study revealed the power that a situation has an influence on a person's behaviour and how easy people can conform to social roles. A strength of the Stanford prison experiment is that Zimbardo had high control over certain variables such as the selection of participants. Zimbardo made potential participants complete personality tests, and the most emotionally stable candidates were selected to take part in the Stanford prison experiment. This was done to rule out any individual personality difference which could affect his findings and subsequently increases the internal validity of his study. A methodological criticism of the research is that Zimbardo's sample was androcentric. This means that we are unable to make generalizations to explain conformity, conforming to roles for all individuals, as we are unable to predict how females would have behaved if placed in the Stanford prison experiment. Consequently, this weakens the population validity of the research and support for research into conforming social roles. Furthermore, Zimbardo was heavily criticized for the ethics of his research. Participants were not protected from psychological harm, with one participant being released after 36 hours after suffering from acute anxiety. Also, when one of his participants asked to leave the study, Zimbardo spoke to him as a superintendent worried about the running of his prison, rather than a researcher whose responsibilities are towards his participants, thus reducing the appropriateness of the study, and as the ends of the study may not justify the means. It would also be difficult to replicate the study due to the ethical risks, which would question the reliability of the study. A further criticism is the lack of realism. Participants were merely playing a role. Their performances reflected how stereotypes of how prisoners and guards are supposed to behave. One guard based his role on a character from a film. Prisoners rioted because they thought that this was what real prisoners did, and Zimbardo's data revealed that 90% of the prisoners' conversations were about prison life. The stimulation seemed so real to them, in turn reducing the internal validity of the study. Milgram's research into obedience. Research into obedience was conducted by Milgram. He recruited 40 male participants using a newspaper from different social backgrounds to take part in a study about memory. During the experiment, there were two Confederates, an experimenter, the authority figure, and the learner. The participant took on the role of teacher and was told that he must administer increasingly strong electric shocks to the learner each time that he got a question wrong on the learning task. The shock started from 15 volts to a maximum of 450 volts. The learner sat in an adjacent room so that the participant would hear his increasing signs of discomfort and pain. If the participant wanted to stop, the experimenter would say things like, "It is essential that you continue." Milgram found that no participant stopped below 300 volts, and 65% of participants delivered the maximum 450 volts, which would kill a person. Milgram carried out a large number of variations as he wanted to see whether it would have an effect on obedience levels. When the proximity levels changed, such as if the learner and the student were placed in the same room, Milgram found that the levels of obedience greatly decreased. When changing the location from prestigious Yale University to rundown office blocks, obedience levels also decreased. Finally, when the experimenter was wearing plain clothes rather than a lab coat and issuing out instructions, obedience levels dropped to 20%. Milgram's study has been criticized for being unethical, as participants were deceived into believing that the allocation of roles as teacher and learner was completely random, and that they were administering real electric shocks. Because of deception, they were not able to give informed consent. Secondly, although participants did have the right to withdraw, he made it very difficult for them to do so. The ethical issues lowered the appropriateness of the research. However, when debriefed, 85% of participants said that they were pleased to take part in the experiment. A further limitation of this research is that it was a lab experiment. Therefore, participants would not think that a university conducting research would allow them to harm someone else, and so they may have guessed that the shocks were not real, thus resulting in such high obedience levels. It is therefore questionable whether the results can be generalized to real-life situations. This consequently weakens the ecological validity of the research. A further methodological criticism of the research is that Milgram's sample was androcentric. This means that we are unable to make accurate generalizations to explain obedience in all individuals, as we are unable to predict how females would have behaved if placed in this situation. This subsequently weakens the population validity of the research and the support that the research has into obedience. An alternative theory could be SIT. So, obedience is about group identification with the experimenter. When obedience levels fell, the participants identified more with the victim. Haslam and Reicher suggest that the first three prods are appeals for help with science, so experiments requires you to continue. Only the fourth prod demands obedience. Every time this was used, the participant quit. The participants did not give shocks due to obedience, but due to their identification with the experimenter as a scientist. Milgram's situational variables. Describe and evaluate two situational variables that have been shown by Milgram to affect obedience to authority. After conducting his original study on obedience, he carried out a large number of variations in order to consider whether situational variables would increase or decrease obedience. Proximity involved the physical closeness or distance of an authority figure to the person that they were giving instructions to. It also involved the physical distance between the learner and the teacher. In Milgram's proximity variation, when the teacher and the learner were in the same room, obedience levels dropped from the original study of 65% to 40%. It drops even lower to 30% when the teacher was asked to hold down the learner's hand on an electroshock plate each time they answered a question incorrectly. Another situational variable that Milgram investigated was whether uniform could affect an individual's response to obey. Milgram found that people in a position of authority often have a specific outfit that is symbolic of their authority. In the original study, the experimenter wore a grey lab coat, whereas in the variation study, instructions were given by a Confederate who was wearing everyday clothes. The obedience levels dropped to 20%, the lowest in all of the variations. Lastly, it was thought that the location of where an order is issued and whether there is any status associated with the location can influence levels of obedience. Milgram found that obedience levels dropped to 47.5% when the experiment was repeated in run-down office buildings, instead of the prestigious Yale University. There is support for the idea that situational factors such as changing of the location of the city can decrease levels of obedience. In a variation of Milgram's study where the location of the experiment was moved from the prestigious surroundings of Yale University to some rundown office buildings, the levels of obedience dropped from the original figure of 65% to 45%. This suggests that the status of authority of the authority figure and the setting is a key factor in resisting obedience. Many researchers have criticized the internal validity in Milgram's study as it was a staged situation. It is likely that the participants in Milgram's variation realized that this is because of the extra manipulation, such as when a member of the public was asked to step in for the experimenter. Milgram himself agreed that the participants were likely to have figured out the truth. This weakens the validity of his findings as it is difficult to establish whether the results were genuinely due to the operation of obedience or due to the participants seeing through the deception. Another limitation is that The research is androcentric, so Milgram used an all-male sample, which means we're unable to make accurate generalizations to explain obedience in all individuals, as we're unable to predict how females would have behaved if placed in this situation. This weakens the population validity of the research and the support of the research that it has into obedience. Is it a universal theory? So, Milgram's research has been replicated in other cultures. Miranda et al. Found that over 90% of obedience in Spanish students. These findings indicate that Milgram's conclusions about obedience are not limited to American males but are valid across all cultures and can be extrapolated to females, thus increasing the population validity of his research. Explanations of obedience. Agentic shift. When people receive an order from someone in authority, Milgram claimed that they shift from an autonomous state which they feel responsible for their own actions to an agentic state in which they act as an agent for carrying out the orders for someone else. This process is called an agentic shift. Agentic shift is also reinforced by people wishing to maintain a positive self-image and not breaching commitment that they have made to the experimenter. This is a binding factor. For a person to shift from an agentic shift, they must perceive a legitimate authority, i.e. someone who is seen to be in a position of social control within a situation. We have learned acceptance of legitimate authority from childhood from our parents and teachers. Milgram's research highlighted the powerful authority figures, as when participants entered the laboratory, an experimenter wearing a white lab coat first approached them. Evidence to support this has been found by Blass and Schmidt, who showed a film of Milgram's study to students and asked them to identify who they felt was responsible for the harm to the learner. The results found that most of the students blamed the experimenter rather than the participant. The study highlights the responsibility lay with the experimenter, as he was the legitimate authority figure, as well as an expert authority. He was a scientist. These findings suggest that a perceived legitimate authority does increase the chances of obedience occurring. However, this research can be criticised for being sample biased. By using only students, researchers can argue that the findings do not represent the rest of society. If the researcher had used all the participants, they may have given different answers, such as believing that the participants should take responsibility for their own actions. Therefore, we can question the population validity of the findings, as we are unable to generalise the findings to the rest of the population, thus weakening its support for explanations of obedience. A strength of legitimacy of authority as an explanation for obedience is that it can help us to understand cultural differences in obedience. Kilham and Mann replicated Milgram's study in Australia and found that only 16% of their participants administered electric shocks to the maximum voltage, whereas Mantal found that 85% of German participants went to the maximum voltage scale. These findings indicate that obeying a legitimate authority is not universal and is subject to the different structures of society and the way that children are raised to perceive authority figures. IDA, it can help to explain real-life obedience. The My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War can explain power hierarchy in the US Army. The Army had authority and recognized by the US government and the law. Soldiers assume orders given to them by the hierarchy to be legal, even orders to kill and rape. The legitimacy of authority explanation is able to give reasons why destructive obedience is committed. There are implications in that more training can be provided to public sectors, for example the Army or the Navy, to make sure that atrocities like what happened in My Lai are never repeated. and this increases the appropriateness of research. Authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience. Adorno argued that authoritarian personality is a personality type that made individuals susceptible to obeying people in authority. It developed as a result of strict and harsh parental upbringing. It can also be due to having conditional love, where the parents' love depends on how the child behaves. This creates a lot of resentment and anger in the child who cannot express their negative feelings to their parents. Thus, they displace their feelings onto others who they see as weaker. Individuals with authoritarian personality have exaggerated respect for authority and submissiveness to it. Also, they are likely to have right-wing views and perceive and act in a hostile manner to those they perceive as having lower status than them. Their right-wing views also affect how they look at gender and race. The way that authoritarian personality is assessed is through the fascism scale, also known as the F scale. Supportive evidence for authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience comes from research by Adorno et al. Adorno et al. Conducted a study on 2,000 white middle-class Americans and measured their unconscious attitudes towards other racial groups. He created scales to measure this, and one was the fascism scale, the F scale. The findings revealed that those who scored high on the F scale were especially likely to be obedient to authority. There was a strong correlation between having an authoritarian personality and carrying prejudiced views. Those with authoritarian personality seemed very conscious of their own status and had exaggerated respect for those of high status. This suggests that authoritarian personality can lead to obedience, and increases the validity of authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience. A weakness of this research is that it used a restricted sample of only white middle-class Americans. This is a problem as it makes the research biased through androcentrism. This means that it is difficult to make accurate generalizations, as females may have displayed different results, and this in turn reduces the population validity as well as its support for authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience. A further limitation for the research is that it used a correlational design. It assumes that people who had harsh parental upbringing ended up having an authoritarian personality. It could be due to other factors such as having low self-esteem, and this resulting in picking on others in an attempt to increase their low self-esteem. Due to the fact that we can't establish cause and effect, this reduces the internal validity of the research and its support for authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience. Additionally, a weakness of this research is that dispositional explanations cannot explain obedience in entire societies. An authoritarian personality cannot be simply due to one's personality. A more appropriate explanation would be social identity. For example, the majority of the Germans had identified with the anti-Semitic Nazi state, and this could be why they followed the views. This reduces the appropriateness of Adorno's theory for obedience. Discuss research into the authoritarian personality for obedience. Adorno investigated whether being obedient was due to having an obedient personality. 2,000 middle-class white Americans, and he measured their unconscious attitudes towards other racial groups. Adorno created several scales to investigate this, including a fascism scale, the F scale, to measure authoritarian personality. Those who scored high on the F scale were especially likely to be obedient to authority. A strong positive correlation between authoritarianism and prejudice was found. People who showed a high authoritarian personality were conscious of their own status and had excessive respect for those of higher status. They also had contempt for people who they perceived to be inferior of them. A weakness is that it used a restricted sample. They were all white middle-class males, and is androcentric, which means we cannot make accurate generalizations, which weakens the population validity. And then another weakness is that it used a correlational design, therefore we cannot establish cause and effect as it overlooks other factors. And another weakness is the methodological flaws. The questions were formatted so that they could get a high score of authoritarianism. The participants could select the same boxes for all the answers. This weakens the internal validity and scale as it fails to truly measure authoritarian personality, but instead acquiesces, which is agreeing to everything. Another limitation is that it can't be simply due to one's personality. Adorno's explanations are considered to be limited. Adorno's explanation is considered to be limited, and that a more appropriate explanation would be that social identity explains obedience. The majority of the German people identified with the anti-Semitic Nazi state, which reduces their appropriateness. Resistance to social influence. Social support can help people to resist the pressures to conform. This can occur if there are other people present who are not conforming. The person not conforming does not have to give a correct answer, but by having someone who is not following the majority will enable the individual to be free to follow their conscience. These people act as models to show others that resistance to social influence is possible. Locus of control is how a person believes that they have control, is how much a person believes that they have control over events that happen in their lives. This is usually measured along a scale with internal at one end and external control at the other end. Internal control refers to those people who see that they have a great deal of control over their own behaviour and will take responsibility for their own actions. They tend to be confident and not need social approval. External control refers to those who believe that their behaviour is controlled by other forces such as luck or fate. People with an internal locus of control are much more likely to resist the pressure to conform than those with an external locus of control. The role of social support in resisting social influence was highlighted in one of Milgram's variations, as the rate of obedience dropped from 65% to 10% when the genuine participant was joined by a disobedient confederate, an ally. These findings indicate that social support can aid in resisting pressures to conform. Research to support the link between locus of control and resisting social influence was investigated by Holland, who repeated Milgram's baseline study using internals and externals. His results found that 37% of internals did not continue to the highest shock level and showed resistance, whereas only 23% of externals continued. These findings suggest that internals showed greater resistance to authority and thus increases the validity of the locus of control explanation to resistance. However, a weakness with Milgram's study is that he deceived his participants, and also the research was in an artificial environment, so it lacks mundane realism. However, there are gender differences in independent behaviour. Research has found that males are more internal and are more likely to show independent behaviour than females. This may be due to socialisation differences, because men are socialized to be more independent and women are socialized to be dependent. It could also be due to the perceived opportunities in the workplace, with men more likely to progress further in their career. This suggests that resist the pressures to conform is resistance to the pressures to conform is dependent on one person's gender rather than locus of control, thus weakening its validity as an explanation. Minority influence. Minority influence refers to situations where one person or a small group of people can influence the beliefs and behaviours of others. Minority influence is most likely to lead to internalization, where both private and public beliefs are changed by the process. For minority influence to be successful, there are a number of factors which need to be considered. So it goes consistency, commitment, augmentation principle, and flexibility, and then the snowball effect. So first, the minority's view must remain consistent over a period of time. This will help to increase the attention and amount of interest it will gain from other people. It can also cause people to restart thinking their own views. Minority influence is most powerful if they engage in extreme activity, which will draw attention to their view. These activities need to involve some risk to the minority, as it will demonstrate their commitment to the cause. As a result, the majority members will pay even more attention, and this is known as augmentation principle. Some psychologists have argued that consistency is not always the most effective method for minority influence, and that it can be interpreted negatively. They propose that members of a minority must be prepared to adapt their point of view and accept reasonable and valid counter-arguments. The key for success is to have a balance between consistency and flexibility. All of these three factors can contribute in the snowball effect where the minority view has become the majority view. Evidence which demonstrates the importance of consistency was found by Wood et al. He carried out a meta-analysis of almost 100 similar studies to the Moscovici slide study. The findings revealed that minorities who were seen to be consistent were most influential in comparison to an inconsistent group. This suggests that consistency is a major factor in minority influence. A methodological criticism of the study that they used is that they used a meta-analysis. The findings of the research that they examined may have been prone to inaccuracies due to factors such as lack of control of variables. This can increase the validity of the findings and weaken its support for minority influence. A methodological criticism with the minority influence research is that the tasks involved in the study, such as identifying the colour of a slide, are as artificial as Ash's line study. Research is therefore far removed from how minorities attempt to change the behaviours of majorities in real life. In cases such as jury decision making and political campaigning, the outcomes are vastly important. This means that the findings of minority influence studies such as the Moscovicis lack external validity and are limited in what they can tell us about how minority influence works in real life situations. A further limitation with minority research is that the application to real life is limited. This is due to studies make a clear distinction between majority and minority, but real life situations are more complicated. The difference is about more than just numbers. Majorities usually have power and status. Minorities are committed and tight-knit groups whose members know and support each other. Minority influence research rarely reflects the dynamics of these groups, so findings may not apply to real-life minority influence situations, which exert more powerful influence. This reduces the appropriateness of research into minority influence. Social change. Minority influence brings about social change because when one person or a small minority starts to behave differently from the majority, it creates a tension. If the argument of the minority contradicts the current view of the majority, this creates conflict. This creates conflict which we are motivated to reduce. In order to do this, we examine the arguments of the minority to better understand them. If the minority is consistent, the majority will take their arguments more seriously. If the minority's arguments alter, then they become weaker. Deeper processing will allow people to start rethinking their own views. The augmentation principle states that if the minority suffer or make sacrifices for their cause, they are more likely to make an impact and make the majority believe that the cause is worthy. The term snowball effect is used to describe the mass movements of members of the majority towards the minority position. Once a few members start to move, the minority gathers momentum as more and more people convert to the minority position. Social cryptomnesia is when people have a memory that changes occurred but can't remember how it happened. Support for these principles underlying social change is illustrated in real-life examples such as the suffragettes. By holding constant rallies and producing educational pamphlets, they were able to create a conflict in the minds of the majority group members, drawing their attention to the idea of the votes for women. The suffragettes maintained their position over 15 years and were consistent in their arguments regardless of the attitudes of those around them. The fight for the voice continued even when faced with the imprisonment or death by a hunger strike. As a result, majority group members were more likely to take their views seriously and be affected by them because of the augmentation principle. Acceptance of the suffragettes' position was gradual, suggesting a snowball effect in political opinion. Support for this principle underlying social change is illustrated in real-life examples such as the African American civil rights movement. By holding constant civil rights marches, they were able to create a conflict in the minds of people of the majority group members, drawing their attention to the situation by providing social proof of the problem. The civil rights activists maintained their position by holding many marches and were consistent in their arguments, regardless of the attitudes of those around them. Their fight to end black separation continued even when some of their freedom riders were beaten for challenging why black people had to sit separately on buses. As a result, majority group members were more likely to take their views seriously and be affected by them because of the augmentation principle. Civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King continued to press for charges that gradually got the attention of the US government. In 1964, the US Rights Act was passed, which prohibited discrimination. Moscovici believes that consistency is the most important factor. Research supports this where the minority tried to convince the majority that something was green when in fact it was blue. The first group consistently argued it was green when the second said a mixture of answers between green and blue. The consistent group managed to convince the majority more than the inconsistent group. This suggests that inconsistency is a major factor in minority influence creating social change. A methodological criticism with the minority influence research is that the tasks involved in the study, such as identifying the colour of a slide, are as artificial as the Ashes Line study. Research is therefore far removed from how minorities attempt to change the behaviours of majorities in real life. In cases such as jury decision making and political campaigning, the outcome are vastly more important. This means that the findings of minority influence studies such as Moscovici study lack external validity and are limited in what they can tell us about how minority influence works in real life situations.